the most important support that you can give people at the beginning of any change is to listen to them. Because what leaders tend to do is try to talk people out of their hesitations and fears. They try and reassure them and dismiss them. And no, you don't understand. It's going to be fine. All that does is just get people stuck harder in difficult, costly, and weird. So if you really can listen through those initial hesitations and fears, and people feel heard, feel seen, feel safe, then almost without exception, they'll get to the point where they're ready to hear about the rest of the support you can offer. We have tools, we have training, we have this person's going to be your mentor, here's the timeline. But until you listen through their difficulties with it, they're not available to hear about what you're going to do to make it easier.
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Erika Andersen, who's going to share how to change and why it's so hard to do so. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and create harmony to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. Today's quote comes from Epictetus. We can't control the circumstances of our lives, but we can always control our reaction to those circumstances. This is really the secret to life. Knowing what we can and can't control and letting go of what we can't and just focus on what we can. I know it sounds so simple, but it's so hard. I know, because I struggle with this all the time. As always, we like to cover our last week's action step, which was to express gratitude with a thank you card. I have a habit of doing this. I keep a stack of cards right next to my desk, and I have stamps. And so when the moment strikes, I can just write it out. It's quick. It takes a moment. And actually sent a thank you card to Ramon, who gave us that action step, for joining me on the podcast. Let's face it, for a lot of people, change is hard. And today we'll learn why, and also how long it really takes to bring about change. I have to be honest, I was a little surprised at the amount of time needed. The reality, as you will hear, is that change is coming faster and faster, and we need a framework to deal with it, both at home and at work. They're saying that most companies in the S&P 500, I think about half, won't be here in the next 10 to 20 years, which means we're going to face disruption. Are you ready for it? The rate of change is also increasing. So we've either got to learn to adapt and keep moving, or we're going to find ourselves considerably struggling. Hopefully, we'll have some answers for you. Today's guest is Erika Andersen. She is the founding partner of Proteus International, a coaching, consulting, and training firm that focuses on leader readiness. For over 3 decades, she served as a consultant and advisor to top executives at today's leading organizations, including Amazon, Spotify, Charter, and the Yale School of Public Health. She's also the author of 4 best-selling books. She's also the host of the Proteus Leader Show. a business and leadership podcast. Let's meet Erika and learn from her. Welcome to Rich Your Soul, Erika Andersen. It's great to have you join us today.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
And I'm excited to learn from you today. We always like to start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
My recollection is that my school taught me nothing, but my family was good. My dad, especially both my dad and my mom, they were much, I think, more conscious and explicit about money than most of my friends' parents, and didn't shrink away from it. And my dad especially taught me a lot about money, about investing. By the time I was 10 or so, I think they gave me an allowance that I had to use for particular things. I remember very specifically that when I was 13, they upped my allowance so I could buy my school clothes. I remember my dad taught me the rule of 72 when I was about 14. So, they were really into it. And it was great. I feel like it gave me a wonderful foundation. And therefore, when I got to be a young adult and had to manage my own money, it was not, it was all of a piece with what I'd learned since I was quite young. So I thought, I think that was a wonderful thing for them to have done, and I really appreciate it.
Do you know what prompted that? Like, was that something that they learned somewhere, or is it just that they wanted you to understand money?
I think my parents were more communicative and explicit about a lot of things than most parents in the 50s and 60s. One of my favorite stories about my parents, my dad, they came of age in the late 30s and early 40s. My dad went to the war and came back, and they decided consciously who would be the breadwinner in the 1940s. And my dad wanted to be a lawyer and my mom wanted to be a journalist. And they decided that if they were going to have kids, which they wanted to do, that a lawyer could be a better, would make more money, would be a better breadwinner than a journalist. So my mom always indulged her passion in journalism on the side. She wrote, she did nonprofit things, and my dad was the breadwinner. And because they didn't want, this is just so wonderful and amazing to me, because they didn't want the power dynamic to be out of sync, my mom took care of the money. She made the kind of money decisions and, made the spending decisions primarily because my dad was making the money and he didn't want to feel like he had all the money power. So he made the money and my mom made most of the family financial decisions, which I think is so cool.
This is not the typical story we get.
Yeah.
And especially from that generation.
Yes.
Now, they were post-Depression then, correct?
Just post-Depression. They were young kids and young teenagers during the Depression. And another thing that goes into this is both her mom and both of my maternal and my paternal grandmother were suffragists. They were heavily into getting the vote and women's rights. And there's a whole nother story about my paternal grandmother being the first person in her family to go to college. She went to teachers college and was a teacher for a few years before she married my grandfather. My other grandmother did this whole thing. Well, I could go on and on, but her story was her dad was very misogynistic and wanted her to just not get married and stay home and take care of him and her mom. And she and her older brother made up this whole story that she needed to move to Omaha to kind of take care of him. What she actually did was move to Omaha, got her own apartment, went to secretarial school and got a job. So this is in the 1910s, so I come from a long line of independent and forward-thinking human beings,
That's quite interesting. And it's interesting that they took the intention to teach you about money.
Yes.
And that they were so intentional with it, because most people aren't.
Yes.
And I'm sure that set you up for a good financial foundation, which you said it did.
Yes, for sure.
So how did you get from there to where you are today?
Oh, boy, we could take the rest of the hour, so I'll do the condensed version. So in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, I was working in, I would say, management training and learning. And what I noticed was in the 1980s, lots of the skills that we think of as being absolutely essential these days, leadership, management, teaming, communication, they were called soft skills. I don't know if you remember that. Like, they are not very important. We don't really need them. And it was clear to me that these were, as everything sped up and flattened out, that these skills were going to become increasingly important. And in fact, when I started my company, Proteus, in 1990, our first tagline was Proteus, skills for mastering the future, because that's what I thought these skills were going to be. So that was one of my intentions. And then the other intention I had was I really wanted to be what has subsequently come to be called a business partner. At the time in the 80s and 90s, people who did training and even consulting, it was like widgets. They were like vendors. Here, you sell us this thing. And what I wanted to do, which became the mission of our company, was help our clients clarify and move toward their hope for future. I wanted to work with them to help them really get clear about the future they wanted to create for themselves, either personally or organizationally, and then have a variety of mechanisms to help them do that. So that's why I started Proteus, and that's what we've been doing for the last 30 plus years.
How has the business world changed over that time? Because as you talked about back then, and I think they still talk about soft skills today, they might be a little bit more defined and they become much more important. But yet, when we look around, no one's teaching soft skills to the kids.
Well, yes. And I've had many conversations about that. And some people are like my younger daughter, who's a doctor, I was thrilled that there were some things in her medical school curriculum about how do you talk to people and how do you listen well and how do, so it's slow, but it's beginning to shift, I think. And, the primary ways in which the business world, from my point of view, has changed in the last 30 years are more, this word I use intentionally, humanistic, more understanding how important the human side of business is, that people are happy at work, that people are more productive when they feel more trusting, that all the things about psychological safety, those weren't even things 30 years ago. And then also on top of that, just the amazing shifts in technology. I was a couple of years ago, when it was our 30th anniversary, I was looking for the first letter that was ever written on Proteus stationery. And actually it was a letter to Fortune magazine, giving them a hard time because their 50 big thinkers of the 1990s were all men and mostly white. And so I was giving them a hard time. I'm very happy that was my first letter. But on stationery, sent like a letter. When was the last time you sent a business letter on a piece of paper to an address that wasn't just, So, it's been remarkable this last 30 plus years.
Technology sure has changed. And, it's funny. I remember hearing the early days, and I think it was companies like IBM. At IBM, you wore blue. If you came in a brown suit, they sent you home, right?
Yeah. Yes.
It was just a very different world. And it was much more about conformity and following the system than bringing about change or doing something different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, the way I used to talk about it is 30, 40 years ago, it was expected that when you came to work, you would leave large chunks of your personality and of your intention and of your passion in a box by the door and just bring in some small part of yourself that was focused on doing the task at work. And I think that is really starting to change, especially because millennials and Gen Z just forget it. They're not going to put up with that. They want to bring all of who they are to work,
And that makes sense. I mean,
yes,
work should be fun. And I think now with more and more choices, it becomes the opportunity to do that.
Yes.
So that kind of brings about the book, because the book is all about this, right? It's change from the inside out, making you, your team, and your organization change capable.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write the book?
Well, I write books. So this is the fifth book I've written, and I'm honored that they've all done pretty well. And when I go to write a book, it's because I get curious about something. And we at Proteus have had a change practice for over a decade. And I like to think, I know that we are very good at helping our clients integrate the human and technical or practical sides of change And there were still a couple of core questions that I wanted to answer. So the two questions that kept occurring to me in 2018 when I started thinking about writing this book were, why is change so hard for us? I really thought if I could find answers to that, that would be very helpful. And what actually happens when an individual human being goes through a change? What happens mentally and emotionally when we go through change? So that's why I started writing the book. I wanted to answer those two questions. And then as I found the answers, and I think I found very good and helpful answers, I was thrilled to see that those answers really lined up with our 5-step change model and made it even more, enabled us to make it even more powerful in terms of how we help people through change.
And so in reading the book, it's people don't like change, right? It's hardwired into us. And yet we are now at a time in history where change is happening faster than ever. The rate of change is becoming incrementally fast. And if you don't change, you're going to be left behind. I think they said half of the companies in the S&P 500 will not be there in 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's a dramatic change.
Yes.
And the other thing you said in the book is that 70% of all change initiatives fail. And it's, again, comes back to we don't like change. So what was the answer to your question? Why is change so hard?
Well, so I started looking at history. I mean, I think so much of who we are now arises from who we have been. And I started thinking about people's lives in the past. So if you think about someone's life 100 or 200 or 500 or even 1,000 years ago, a person's life did not change much from beginning to end. If you grew up, let's say in the United States 150 years ago, you almost certainly grew up where your parents had grown up. You almost certainly did the same work that your parents had done, ate the same food, went to the same church, had the same things happen. Your kids grew up, were born, grew up, old people died. Very stable to us, unimaginably stable. That was a person's life. And when there was a big change, it was almost always a threat and a danger. It was a war or a famine or a flood or a plague or, something like, oh my gosh. And the best bet, almost without exception, was to come back to that previous known as soon as possible. So that's how we're wired, to stay stable, to stay predictable, to come back to the norm when there's a change, which is an aberration. After a famine, we want to eat. After a war, we want to have peace. So that wiring has served us for many thousands of years. But then starting in the 19th century, continuing in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, it's just speeding up every day. You know, because you've read the book, at the beginning of the book, I used the story of when I was a little kid and we got our first television set. And then 10 years later, color TV. 10 years. We had 10 years to get used to this wild new thing, television, before we had to change even a little bit to color TV. That level of technological innovation now happens about every half hour, right? So in 60, 70 years ago, the pace of change was still relatively stately. And now it's just, so we need to rewire ourselves. That historical wiring that tells us that change is dangerous and we should protect ourselves from it and come back to the known, the previous known as soon as possible, it's just no longer serving us. So when I figured that out, it really made it make sense to me how our initial response to most change that's imposed on us is danger, Will Robinson, right? That it's going to be a threat. And then, so the second thing I tried to answer was this, well, what happens when we actually do change? Because I felt if I could get clear about that, then we can help people in that rewiring process. So that was my next question.
And so what has to happen to allow us to change? Because I remember in the corporate, it's always, that's the way we've always done it. Mm-hmm. That was the standard. Nowadays, it's like, yeah, well, you're no longer going to be here if that's your attitude.
If that's your attitude, exactly. So we discovered when I went to answer this second question, which is yours, how do we go through change? We came to this understanding that we now call the change arc in the sense of, harder going up the hill, easier coming down. And the first thing that happens in this, what we call change arc, when a change comes at us, corporately or personally, the first thing, and we call this proposed change, there are some things we want to know, and they're very predictable. We want to know three things. We want to know, what does this mean for me? What is this change going to mean for me personally? We want to know, why is it happening? Because we have such a preference for the status quo that we need some really good reasons, right? So why is this happening? And then the third thing we want to know is, what will it look like when it's done? Because part of our fear of change is fear of the unknown, which a lot of psychologists now think is our deepest fear. So if somebody says we're going to make this big change and it's blurry, we don't know exactly what it's going to look, that's terrifying. So we want to know, what's it going to look like? So we started trying to gather this information, and then this is where it got exciting. What we saw is that even as people are gathering this information, they generally have a negative mindset about the change. They assume that the change is going to be difficult and costly and weird. And difficult means I don't know how to do this, and people are going to get in the way of me doing it. Just there are lots of obstacles. That's what difficult means. Costly, and this was so interesting, costly means I think this change is going to take from me things I value. And it could be things, obvious things like time and money, but it's more likely to be things, intrinsic things like identity and reputation and power and relationship and freedom, right? That this change will take from me these things that are critical to me. And weird just means strange. This is not how we do things around here. So you can tell when people start asking questions, our mindset kind of leaks out our mouth. So people start asking these questions about what and why and what will it look like. And their responses let you know that they are starting out thinking of this as difficult, costly, and weird. You say, well, what's this going to mean for me? They say, what's this going to mean for me? And you say, well, we're going to have to learn some new skills. And they go, oh, God, I don't have time for that. And that's going to make me look like an idiot. And I've got so many other things to do. And when am I, they tell you how difficult and costly it's going to be and weird. So this was very clear to us. And that's how people get stuck and don't want to change. And that's, I think, largely responsible for this 70% failure rate. But then when we noticed the people who did change, what we saw is that the first thing that happened before they started to change is that their mindset shifted. And again, you can tell by how they talked about it. They started to think that the change could be easy, rewarding, and normal. They started thinking, rather than being difficult, maybe I could do this. Maybe it's at least doable. I could do this. I could learn how to do this. They started looking at ways in which the change would give them more than it would take away, more rewarding than costly. And normal in this sense means if you look around and people who you think of as being like you, or people who you admire and want to emulate, if they're doing it, it starts to feel normative, which is one reason why it's so important for leaders to model changes. But as a person starts to think, I can see how this change could be easy or at least doable, rewarding, and normal, then you can see they begin to be willing to hear about it, to learn, to do the behaviors that the change requires, and then the change can occur and be adopted. So we realize that the absolute core, which is why it's called change from the inside out, of any change, whether it's one person or 50,000, is people making that mindset shift. And so focusing as leaders on how to make it for ourselves and how to help other people make that mindset shift around a change. Does that make sense?
It does. They have to see that the future state will be better.
Could be better.
The process from here to there will not be as difficult as they imagine it's going to be.
Exactly correct. And so we have what we call change levers, these, and it's really baked into our change process to help create a transition plan that helps people make that shift to seeing how it could be doable and what are the rewards that it will give them so that they can make that shift.
Throughout the book, you use the story of a company and a business owner and how they made the shift in their company. One of the things that I kind of found surprising was the amount of time it took to bring about this change. I'm not a patient person. And it looked like it took a year and a half to go through that whole process, which is quite a bit of time. And a lot of work went into that. Is that normal?
Yes, real change, transformative change in an organization generally takes much longer than people want it to, and then they think it's going to. Because what happens, and I've seen this so often, so a change, when an organization thinks about a change, especially a big organization, usually it's a small group of fairly senior people who are saying, okay, we need to change this, whatever it is. In the case of the story, it was they really had to change their business model from just only being in-store to being a combination of in-store and online. And then they had to change the underlying systems to support that, particularly the financial system, but, lots of systems. And so even though it was a fairly small company, only about 100 people, the change itself took 3 to 6 months to actually integrate, and then another 6 months to actually, operationalize and adopt. And so, it takes a while. And it's hard because the senior people tend to get clear about what the change is and what they think should happen pretty early on. But then you have to actually make the change, which usually has lots and lots of levels. And more important, you have to help everyone through the change. You have to cascade it through the whole organization.
If we're going to move to a world that's changing ever faster, how do we create an environment where that's possible, that we can change in a faster way?
I love that question. So it's why the subtitle of the book is Making You, Your Team, and Your Organization Change-Capable. So change happens faster the more capable you are, the more you can shift your own and other people's mindset quickly. So part of any big change is making the change itself, but also making the leaders, the individuals, and the organization itself more change-capable so that you can change more quickly in future. At the very end of the book, I make it so that the end of the book is the beginning of the pandemic, as you recall. And,
yes.
Jade, now the CEO, her head of HR and her CFO come to tell her about it. There's this hotspot in Westchester County. This is March of 2020. And my belief, these are all made up people, but my belief is that they will be able to respond to that change more quickly because of the experience they've had changing their business model over the previous year plus. And some of it is the mindset, the skills and mindset of the leaders, the mindset of the employees in the organization, who hopefully, if you go through change properly, they now see change as more than norm. And so it's easier for them to go through change. But it's also the organization itself. And one of the things I talk about a lot in the book, as you know, is as you go through any big change, you will see, I talk about the organization is the bridge that you walk to the future on. And systems and processes, structures, and even your culture can be change supportive or change impediments. And hopefully you will use the opportunity to go through a big change to remove those underlying change impediments. So for instance, if you have systems in your organization that are really, or processes that are really clunky and hard to change, hopefully you can change those processes and make them simpler, more streamlined so that they will be able to change better, if that makes sense.
It does. And I've read books on this, and it's funny, in some organizations, they've built systems that haven't updated in years.
Yes, exactly.
And people don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. And it's no longer relevant, but they're still doing it. And so you're just wasting time considerably.
100%. There's a funny story that I heard years ago that I always tell about this, about how systems, just legacy systems that don't change. And the story is, so there's a little kid watching his mom put an Easter ham in the oven. And she puts clothes. Have you heard this story? Do you know the story?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah. So she puts the clothes and gets it all ready. And then she cuts the ends off, puts it in the pan, puts it in the oven. And the little kid says, Mom, why do you cut the ends off the ham? And she goes, I don't know. I thought it was for flavor, or let me call your grandma and see. So she calls up the grandma, and the grandma says, oh yeah, ends off the Easter ham. I don't know. We've always done that. Let me call the great grandma who's in the nursing home. She'll know. I bet she's the one that started that tradition. Let's ask her. So they call up great grandma in the nursing home. They say, the thing we always do, cutting the ends off the ham. Why do we do that? Great grandma says, I had a really small pan. Right? So for 60 years, we've been cutting the end off the ham because great grandma had a really small pan. And there are way too many systems like that in organizations. So I propose, and we often encourage our clients, in fact, there are some clients I'm working on this with right now, to really look at your systems and your processes and your structures in the light of this current change and any change. Is this system or process necessary? And is it going to make it harder to change? And if so, then let's think about changing it.
Today's episode is sponsored by Profit Answer Man Podcast. Did you know that most small business owners hate looking at their financials? It's one reason they may struggle with business success. The Profit Answer Man podcast helps them ensure they are profitable and can pay their employees and weather the storms we all have to face. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Profit Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform. Speaking of culture, you had a quote in there that only 12% of people said they think their company is driving the right culture. And even more, not more surprising, but only 28% said they even understood the organization's culture.
Yeah.
It seems absurd that companies are not, I guess they all overlook this, and we'll get to that later. But if you don't create the culture, somebody will.
Oh, that's exactly right, Rocky. In fact, it's one of the things that we tell people is you have a culture, whether or not you're conscious of it. And so you ought to become conscious of it so that you can be intentional about it and figure out what the values are in your culture. And then, are those the right values? Do you want those to be the values, or do you need them to change? And if you need them to change, then what does that look like, and how? It's hard for people to change their values. So unless you want to change out all the people in your organization, if you shift your values, you're going to have to shift them in a way that still resonate for the people in the organization. And one example I give is like a value that a lot of companies have, consciously or unconsciously, that is very change impedimentary, that really gets in the way of change, is tradition. A lot of companies, it's like tradition, just what you said at the beginning of the interview. We've always done things like this. So then you have to think, well, what's the core thing that tradition is valuing? Is it strength? Is it security? Is it, learning from the past? So how can you shift that value of tradition in a way that opens the way for change, that makes it more change possible? Maybe the value is solidity. Maybe the value is strength. So it's often a really useful exercise to shift to a related value that is not going to get in the way of change, that's not going to be anti-change.
We've had guests on because we always talk about culture, and we always are like, hire to your culture. But if you're changing the culture or enforcing the culture, and as you said, the people there don't buy into it, I mean, it almost seems like they have to go. Or are they willing to change? I guess that's the question. If they're not willing to change, they will not embrace your new culture.
I think that's right. And I'm a big fan, as you might, and certainly this goes all the way back to my parents telling me about money. I'm a big fan of clarity and transparency. So if, the way we talk about company culture, as you know from having read the book, is it's acceptable behaviors and the beliefs and values that underlie and promote and reinforce them. So behaviors are changeable. Beliefs can be changed, but it's hard. Values are hard to change. We form our values as humans early on, and it's hard to change them. So if you feel like you have good people and you want to keep them, but you need to change your culture, then that's why we say try and see if you can shift the cultural values so that they don't do violence to people's sense of how things should be, but they support change. So changing from tradition to solidity or strength. And then what you do is you establish, you define the behaviors for those values that will really support change. Now, at the end of the day, there are probably going to be some people that don't make that shift. And my bias is that the clearer you are, then the clearer you can make it for yourself and for your leaders as to whether or not people will be able to make that shift. Because you can say, this is the new related culture that we're trying to promote. Here's why we think it will be more supportive of change. You cool with that? And the people who just aren't good with it. And you notice at the end of the book, I talked about some people decided to leave the organization because they didn't like this new online thing. Okay, great. Well, then that's the choice you're going to make.
Do you think most people are clear with what their values are? I mean, they may behave based on their values, but can they actually articulate them?
No, I don't think most people are clear what their values are, and but I think they can be helped to articulate them. But I think also if you get clear about what the values of your organization are and articulate them, then people can decide whether or not they're cool with that, whether or not they want to line up with that.
And that I can see. If you tell them what yours are, some people will know, okay, that's a fit for me, or that's really not a fit for me. So I get it from that standpoint. If someone's got clarity, then everyone else can get clarity.
Yes, exactly.
So with COVID, businesses had to change and change fast.
Yes.
What did you notice about the ones that were able to do that? Like, what was it that allowed them to be so nimble?
It goes back to people. The ones, and I like to put Proteus, our company, in this. The ones that were able to change quickly were very clear about that, and what's changing, why, what will it look like when it's done. And they really supported their people through the change. They created a lot of psychological safety, a lot of openness, a lot of transparency. They let people have a hard time with it. I mean, one of the things I've noticed is, I said earlier, we have these 4 change levers that we share with our clients and help them use to help their folks through change. And one of those change levers we call give support. And the most important support that you can give people at the beginning of any change is to listen to them. Because what leaders tend to do is try to talk people out of their hesitations and fears. They try and reassure them and dismiss them. And no, you don't understand. It's going to be fine. All that does is just get people stuck harder in difficult, costly, and weird. So if you really can listen through those initial hesitations and fears, and people feel heard, feel seen, feel safe, then almost without exception, they'll get to the point where they're ready to hear about the rest of the support you can offer. We have tools, we have training, we have this person's going to be your mentor, here's the timeline. But until you listen through their difficulties with it, they're not available to hear about what you're going to do to make it easier.
People want to be heard.
100%. I can't remember, it might have been Oliver Wendell Holmes, this great quote. He said, in the main, people would rather be understood than agreed with. And I think that's right.
And I've noticed that in dealing with issues, that when you explain to people and you hear them out and you tell them why, they may not like it, but they're much more accepting. The other thing I find kind of odd is, people are working in a company and everyone can see the freight train coming. Yeah. And yet everyone is shocked when it affects them. Yeah. Are we just blind, or we don't want to accept? Like, usually, and then afterwards, these people really struggle because it's an emotional toll on them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we have this weird thing as humans that, like, if we just don't look at it, it'll go away. And our our first change lever is, I like how these are coming out in context, we call increase understanding. And that's just about giving people context and rationale. A lot of times when a change does happen, people are just like, this thing's happening, good luck, and that's really all you hear. And, what we found is that the more you can give people the backstory, the stuff they want to know, what does this mean to me? Why is it happening? What will it look like when it's done? Here's how we came to it. Here's what it means for you. Here's how long it'll take. Just increase their understanding of the change, of the context of the change, of the impact that it might have. The more honest and transparent you can be about that, the less they're going to be blindsided, obviously, and the more then they'll have a chance to get their head around it and make that mindset shift.
And I'm assuming that's why it takes time.
Yes, absolutely. Also, you just have to, so just briefly to go through our 5-step model, you can see, and it's not, I love the 5 steps because they're simple and practical, and you can, it's like a Swiss Army knife. You can use it to plan a family vacation, and you can use it to plan a business transformation for 50,000 people. So the first step is clarify the change and why it's needed. So that sounds so simple, but often in organizations that doesn't happen. And it takes a little while. Like, what actually are we changing? Why do we need to change? And the why you need to say in ways that will be meaningful to people. Like the example I often use is, a lot of times senior leadership will say, well, it'll make us more profitable. Okay, that might be meaningful to you if your compensation is tied to profit. But if you're somebody who's going to make $15 an hour no matter what happens, that's probably not very meaningful. So what are the ways in which the change is going to be helpful to them? Clients will like it better. Your time doing administrative things will be less. Those are meaningful changes to the normal person, right? So what's the change and why it's happening? Then, and usually it's this small group thinking through this on behalf of the organization, because this is what they're going to use to bring everybody in down the line. So then the second step is envision the future state. That's that third thing we want to know. What will it look like when it's done? And once you've gotten clear about that, the future you're trying to create by doing this change, then you can also create measures of success. So you can know whether or not the change is actually working while you're doing it. So you do those first two things. And then in the third step, that's when you start bringing people into the tent. You build the change team. Who's actually going to manage and drive this change? And you think about the other stakeholders, the people who are neither part of the initiating team or part of the change team, but who, if they don't get on board, it won't happen. And you bring those people into the tent by sharing with them the work that you've done in the first two steps. And then you build the actual technical, practical change plan, which is just a project, but usually a big, complicated project. Then the fourth step, and this is the step that usually doesn't happen in organizations, we call it leading the transition. And this is all about the human. You figure out the people who are going to be most affected by the change and how they're going to be affected, what's going to be difficult, costly, and weird for them about it, so you can use those change levers to help them through it. And you actually create a transition plan for the people who are going to be most affected and a simpler one for the whole organization. And you layer that on top of the technical plan so that you're then doing those two things together. You make the change practically while you're helping people through their change arc, right? So that's how you do the change. You do human and practical at the same time. And then the fifth step we call keep the change going. So two things here. One is what we were talking about before. You look at ways in which the organization is anti-change and you fix those systems and processes and structure and culture so that future changes will be easier. But you also keep your eye on the change that you're making, because all changes have unintended consequences. And there are going to be secondary things you're going to have to do to make it going and be successful. And you want to keep on that. And if you do those 5 steps, which for a big change can take a couple of years, the wonderful thing is it will be adopted. You will have made a change and you won't fall prey to that 70%.
I think my biggest takeaway from this whole conversation is, if you're going to bring about change, have patience. Like, we're not going to change next week.
Yes.
It's going to take time. We've got to turn this big ship around.
Yes.
And you just have to keep at it, and you have to keep repeating and leading and making sure that everyone understands where you're going and is continuing to stay along.
I love that takeaway, Rocky. I think that's exactly right. And there's a wonderful client that I've been working with for a long time who's trying to make a really big change. And it's a huge change. It's mostly a technological change, but it affects everything about how they do business. And they started trying to do it about 18 months ago. And their initial timeline was that it was going to take a year. And I told them at the time, I said, no, this is going to take at least a couple of years, probably 3 or 4, because it affects every part of your business. So about 6 months ago, they went back to the drawing board, and now they're doing it right. And they've agreed, yes, it's going to take a couple of years. They have a 2025 end point. So they think it's going to take about 3 years, which I think is about right.
Wow.
Yeah.
In a fast moving world, it's something that I would struggle with.
If it's a big change like this that really affects the whole organization, it's going to take a while. Now, the good thing, and I'll say this again, is the better you get at change, the more you can do those little daily changes quickly. The less brutal it is for people to go, you know what? Marketing's going to report into sales. We'll do this pretty quickly. Within a couple of months, it'll happen. Okay, we're good? Good. So then the big things will continue to take a year, 2 years, 3 years, but you can do other things more quickly.
Do you have a favorite story from a client that you can share?
The stories in the book are all sort of conflations because I don't want to out anybody. But this one that I'm talking about is a wonderful story because they are, first of all, they've made many changes they went through a merger 6 years ago that went pretty well. They've made a lot of changes. So the senior team has quite a bit of credibility, which really helps because most of the people in the organization are not going, oh, those guys, they don't know anything and they can't make changes and they're just making this all up and it's just flavor of the month. They're not getting much of that, which is really helpful. And a lot of senior organizations don't have credibility. But I love how they've really got the bit in their teeth now, and they understand that both the technical parts of the change and the human parts of the change are going to have to cascade all the way through their 3,000 people. And they're being very realistic about it, which is really cool.
Why are most senior teams not seen to be credible?
Because they make change badly. They make bad changes and they make change badly. And so people don't trust them anymore. They say, we're going to change this thing. And then either it doesn't change or it changes in such a terrible way that everybody's negatively impacted. And so people just extract their trust.
You know, it has me thinking when I was in corporate, we used to have a saying, well, if you don't like the way things are, it'll change in 6 months. Exactly. Because some of these companies were just every 6 months, there'd be some new change because somebody came along and said, we need to change. Not because anyone thought through the process of where they were going. It was just change for change's sake. Yeah,
I totally agree. And sometimes a new person comes in and they want to sweep clean with a new broom. There's all kinds of dumb reasons to make bad changes. So one of the things we try to help clients not do that is in this first step, which I talked about, of clarify the change in the way it's needed. The why it's needed part is not only saying it in a way that's meaningful to people, but we have people do a very in-depth risk and reward assessment of the change. So what are the rewards of changing? What are the risks of changing and of not changing? So you really try to be a fair witness. You really try and be neutral about it so you can decide whether or not this is actually a good change to make. Because one of the things we always say is, change is not inherently bad, but it's also not inherently good. We're not trying to get people to be change positive. We're trying to get them to be change capable. And part of that is looking at change in a neutral way so that you can tell whether or not a particular change is a good idea. Because even when it's done well, change takes energy. So you don't want to do unnecessary change.
That makes total sense. Is there anything on this topic that we should have talked about but haven't yet?
I guess the only thing I'd like to come back to, I kind of brushed across it briefly, is, that thing that they tell you on airplanes of put on your own mask before attempting to help others. That's one of the main messages that we try to communicate to leaders. It's like, look, if you want your people to be open to a change, you have to go through it first. You have to go through the hard psychological and emotional work of making your own mindset shift, because until and unless you genuinely see this change as easy, or at least doable, rewarding, more rewarding than the alternative, and normal, unless you're really seeing it that way, and more importantly, are doing the behaviors that the change requires, but talk about credibility, nobody's going to follow you over that bridge if you've not already walked over it. So I think that's for leaders to know. You have to jump in the water first. You got to go first. That's how you get people to go through a change.
Back in the old days, the generals would lead the charge.
Exactly.
Maybe we need to go back to that.
Yes, certainly in change. We certainly do.
Based on our conversation, what's one action step people can take to move forward this week?
I love that. And I would say that the first thing to look at is your own self-talk. The beauty of this is, we talk about that shift in self-talk, that shift in mindset being the core to being able to make change. We can each change our own mind. We can change the way we talk to ourselves. So what I would suggest is think of a change that you are currently involved in. It could be personal, it could be professional, it could be world, some change that's affecting you, and about which you have negative self-talk. Listen to what's going on inside your head. And if you're telling yourself, oh, this change is going to be difficult and costly and weird, stop and start to play with shifting it. Start to say to yourself, well, wait a minute. Okay, how could I make it easier? How could it be more rewarding than costly? What could I do to normalize it? Just start asking yourself those questions as a way to prime the pump of shifting your self-talk. And hopefully you'll see your self-talk begins to shift, because the main thing I would love for people to take away from this is you actually can rewire yourself in this way to become more change capable.
We do have the ability to reprogram ourselves if we choose to.
Yes, exactly.
It does take time, just like change, right? We don't snap and we're a new person, and programming takes a while to hold on to take effect.
Yes.
It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Gratitude.
That comes up a lot. Thought you might say change. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Oh, just so about people and the importance of people. I was very task-based in my earlier life, and I feel like I've only later in life learned the importance of connection and deep human transparency and love, and it has served me very well.
And that's shifting in the corporate workspace now, and people are learning we are humans first.
Yes, yes.
If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
I think it would be what I just said. You can change the way you think. You have control over your own internal landscape. I think that is such a powerful thing for anyone, but particularly young people, to understand.
And too often they're programmed and they don't even know it. So just kind of that awareness that, hey, I don't have to do what everyone told me.
Exactly. And I don't have to think what I'm thinking. I can choose to think differently. That's such a powerful understanding.
That is a very powerful understanding. It's going to take your parents a little while to catch up with you, though. Change takes time.
Yeah, exactly.
If people would like to learn more about you, the book, what is the best way for them to do that?
Two things. One is they can go to my website, which is erikaandersen.com. Both my names are spelled oddly, Erika with a K, Andersen with an E, a second E. And they can also go to my business website, Proteus, Proteus-international.com. I think those are the two best places to go. And you can find out everything there.
And we will put those in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, this has been great. I really appreciate it.
Where would you like to see change? Realize it's going to take time, and share the positive impacts that it will make with others. That's how you get them to change. It's a process, and Erika has done a great job to lay out the steps we need to take. You have to make the mindset shift first and make the change in your behaviors so you can lead others. We have the ability to reinvent ourselves and our work. It's up to us to make it happen. The world is changing at a pace that has never been seen in human history. And so we've got to change or be left behind. This week's action step: think of a change you need to make where you might have a negative attitude towards the change, and then start to shift and be more positive about how the change could benefit you. Let's face it, we need to give ourselves a little grace. Being able to be nimble in change is going to be a superpower as we face even more of it, both at work and with technology. Get ready, it's coming. That means we also need to be constantly updating our skills and being flexible. The choice is ours to make. People need to be heard and understood. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them. I got to tell you, this one's big. Allowing people to share their grievances and be felt and heard is amazing to help get through issues. I know I've used that skill when I've had to deal with difficult situations with people who didn't want to hear what I had to say. But when you explain to them why and the thought process and how it was the best possible solution, and you listen to their feedback and let them be heard, things usually work out pretty well. Next week, we've got a great episode with Bew White to share how he lived on purpose. I know you'll love it. If you enjoyed this episode, or you know someone who needs to change, do me a favor and share it with them. I'd appreciate that. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.